What does the future hold for women in Afghanistan? Some have been taken to the streets to protest against the violation of their rights, but the Taliban have already begun restricting their freedom, and many fear the worst is yet to come.
It's absurd. Everything has stopped for us. Many people have left. I feel lonely and desperate.
As the Taliban start to make their mark on women's lives, you'll also hear from a former Afghan government minister who tells us where she thinks the international community is going wrong in its dealings with the country and its new rulers. I'm Banish. Welcome to DW News Asia. Glad you could join us. Life is changing for many people in Afghanistan. For women, the prospects are looking especially bleak. The Taliban seems poised to impose what critics are calling a very regressive version of Sharia law, radically restricting women's freedoms. They're already making moves to banish women from public life, telling them to stay inside and threatening them at demonstrations. Significantly, they have failed to include a single woman in their new interim government, despite women being part of the previous administration and despite promises to be inclusive. In a moment, we'll hear from a former female member of the Afghan cabinet. But first, this report on how life for women appears to be shaping up under Taliban rule.
It takes courage to protest openly against the Taliban, especially for women. Yet these female protesters in Mazar-e-Sharif refuse to be silenced. We demand the creation of secure jobs, both for men and women, and the right to participate in politics for women, the right for women to be selected and elected for leadership positions, and the right to private ownership, the right for women to work in the judicial and legal sector, and the right to freedom of speech. But the Taliban's strict gender rules have already started to affect everyday life. Female students returning to university on the first day of lectures after the summer break found they'd been separated from their male classmates. Before, we all studied together. We were comrades. And now this curtain. It's horrible, but we have no choice. It's absurd. Everything has stopped for us. Many people have left. I feel lonely and desperate. When the Taliban ruled Afghanistan 20 years ago, women's rights were severely curtailed. Women were not allowed to work, they were banned from education, and only allowed in public fully covered and accompanied by a male chaperone. This time around, the hardline Islamists have been keen to portray themselves as more moderate. In their first press conference after taking power, their spokesman promised women's rights would be honoured within the norms of Islamic law, though he failed to elaborate on what exactly this would mean. Many women in Afghanistan expect to return to the dark days of the Taliban's first reign. We spoke to a student at the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul.
You know, like when someone is dreaming for a better life and working for 21 years to just reach the dream, and suddenly in one night everything just damaged. Just imagine. And now I myself feel like I am in a room where only there is a darkness, no hope for a better future or no hope for a light. This is the feeling that I really have.
That feeling of hopelessness is far from unwarranted. 2 weeks ago, the Taliban told working women to stay at home for security reasons, a measure they said was temporary. But many fear this is just one of many steps towards a society in which women will ultimately be deprived of their fundamental rights and freedoms, and all but erased from public life.
And one woman who was a part of Afghanistan's public life till she had to leave the country is Nargis Nehan. She served as Minister of Mines and Petroleum and joins me now from Oslo. Ms. Nehan, welcome. Not one woman in the Taliban government that's been announced. How does that make you feel?
To be honest, you're not surprised, but deeply disappointed, because this is what we have been telling everybody, that Taliban, on the contrary, what their leaderships are saying in Doha, they have not changed a lot. They have not evolved a lot. While as a society working for women inclusion and inclusivity of our society in the political process of country, we have been advocating and we have been giving definition of inclusive, that inclusive should not even be limited to ethnical representatives, but also representative from different gender, from different religious groups, from different part of the society, from different ideology. But what we see that, according to that definition, you cannot call the new cabinet formed by the Taliban in any way an inclusive cabinet.
Speaking of the rights of women, the Taliban have repeatedly said that women will have rights under Sharia law. I wonder if you understand what the Taliban mean by women's rights under Sharia law.
Still, that is, we are also waiting for the Taliban to, in terms of their policy, to articulate more. But on the ground, what we see in the last few weeks, the Taliban have taken charge. I give 3 examples, which alarms me, that Taliban are going to implement once again the very regressive version of Sharia that they have interpreted themselves last time. So women went peacefully for demonstration because most of them are working in public offices and most of them are responsible for as breadwinner of their family. But Taliban began to shoot at them. Secondly, what we saw, the Taliban yesterday announced their cabinet. All you see, it's all mullahs from the Taliban group, inclusive government, but you don't find any other group and any other gender of the society included in their cabinet. And thirdly, the Ministry of Higher Education of Islamic Emirate came up with a policy for the private and public universities to reopen, but we saw that they came with very restrictive policy that there should be parda if the classes have fewer students, and if they have enough students, they should definitely go for separate classes. There should be separate interests for men and women, separate waiting room. So already these 3 examples of telling us a lot about like how much they have changed and how much they have not changed.
But aren't the Taliban articulating what is already common practice in many of Afghanistan's rural areas, where even before the Taliban took over, women couldn't go to work and girls couldn't go to school?
The point is that there are some districts of Afghanistan that still people do not have access to schools, and there are some women in Afghanistan that simply they choose to be at home. But that doesn't mean that you deprive all women of Afghanistan because just you assume that a small group of the society do not want that. That is what a diverse and inclusive society means, that you have to, as a government, and trying to govern a nation, you have to look at the aspiration and demand of all population and try to respond to that, not to the ones that actually resonate with your ideology.
Right. I'd also like to discuss with you what the international community feels about the Taliban's promises of inclusivity. And therefore, at this point, I'd like to play for our viewers what the EU's ambassador and head of the EU delegation to Afghanistan said on Monday in Brussels about women's rights under the Taliban.
There's no need for alarmism in a way, because all what's happening is embedded in the society of Afghanistan, and sometimes alarmism when it's a single focus that prevents us from looking at the entire problems. What I meant by no alarmism is to treat a political actor not by what the entity has said 25 years ago, but to look at what is happening now.
Ms. Nahan, you just heard Andreas Brandt there. Do you think people are being alarmist about the future of women, for women under the Taliban?
Well, I think because many people, even living outside Afghanistan, they are much more aware of Afghanistan, new Afghanistan, aspiration of the new generation, and about the tactics that Taliban have been using as a political group. That's why, of course, they're alarmed. I mean, I don't know when Ambassador Andrea made these statements, but as I told you, look at the cabinet. That gives you, that clearly tell you what the Taliban are thinking. Look at their reaction to the many of hundreds of women that they came out for a peaceful demonstration, and look at their policy for the higher education. The problem that we have is that on one hand, Taliban leadership is promising one thing, they're beginning to deliver totally on the contrary different thing. And then in the meantime, this is something that we have been trying for years to the international community, that you cannot just simply believe in the Taliban or in other politicians that we had previously based on what they tell you and what they promised you with those nice words that they said in the meetings. You have to look at the reality on the ground. That's what's happening. And what is happening in Afghanistan, it might be a very small part of society embedded in Afghanistan, but it definitely cannot represent the majority and overall Afghanistan.
Briefly, Ms. Nehan, do you think the international community has any leverage at all over the Taliban to make them follow their promises?
The international community had a lot of leverage. Unfortunately, they misused it. They didn't use it properly. Still, the international community has a lot of leverage. What I see is lack of consistency in the international community, lack of coordination, and basically lack of seriousness about issues of Afghanistan. They still do not have united stand with regard to dealing with the Taliban. And everybody, once again, is rushing and trying to become advocates for the Taliban, and they're trying to build their own relation with the Taliban without thinking about the consequence of that on the overall, all the policies that we want to pursue with the Taliban.
Nargis Nehan, we'll have to leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And women in the country have been making their presence felt at street protests yesterday and today in different parts of the country. We'll leave you with some of those images and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.